Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we are in Matthew chapter 27. But as you turn there, I'm going to detour for a second. Not because I'm tired and we're going to have a squirrely moment, though I am tired and probably somewhere in the sermon we'll have a squirrel. Because even when I'm incredibly well rested, we have squirrels and elephants and moose that I chase. But this morning in Sunday school, we were reading in Exodus chapter 23. And in there is a discussion about the feast and going to the feast. And I realized that I was wrong. Surprise, it happens. Be glad I'm not the one that your salvation depends upon for lots and lots of reasons. Because I'm not sure that there are a whole lot of people I'm willing to go to the cross for, just so we're clear. But I have made the statement from here, so I'll also reiterate this next week because there'll be more of the people here that I said that to. That the Israelites, at least the males, were required to go twice a year to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, not a privilege, though that's true too. But pilgrimage was the word I was looking for. In order to go to the temple and do sacrifices. I was wrong. It was 3 times a year. The Passover feast, which is what the crucifixion is sat in. Pentecost, which happens a little bit later. And then a festival that is sometimes called the festival, which is what when you find it in the New Testament, you'll sometimes find a reference to the festival. But Exodus 23 has the name Feast of the Ingathering, is the way in which the New American translates it. It's got a little bit of a give and take depending on who translates it. So it is 3 times a year, not 2 times a year. I was wrong. I apologize. Now I don't have to be wrong anymore because I hate being wrong. It bothers me. That's why you get the apology. And there are certain things I don't want to get wrong, and the Word of God is chief among those. Especially since I'm doubly accountable. So if somebody will help me to remember next week that I need to also correct that, because I don't know how many people watch our YouTube channel, I don't want to be wrong. And on the note of our YouTube channel, that is where, oddly enough, because I don't mention the tube of you very often, is where this sermon title comes from. There is a song by the same title, and somebody took that song and scenes from the Passion during his crucifixion, and actually, as the song plays, How Great Is Our God, has the pictures of the crucifixion interlaid as kind of a slideshow. They make it look a lot better because they clearly have a lot more technological skills than I do. And it's really kind of a neat video. It was my intention to link it to my Facebook page, but something about officiating a wedding just totally wrecked that whole being productive weekend plan for me there. Which I knew was going to happen. But it's a really neat thing, which then ends, obviously, with the last frame being the resurrection frame from the Passion, which is its own kind of beautiful picture. But that is the idea that I'm pulling here. Because one of the things that Matthew does here that I find to be so very fascinating, he has spent all of this build-up to the cross. We get to the cross, and as we read that portion today, and the back end of it next week, so we're going to have 2 weeks at least at the cross. But what is really interesting and was really fascinating to me, so I spent some time because it made me go, oh! And when I have those, it's really fun for me. It's a good week. It's been a great week. I don't know if y'all have had as fun of a week as I have, but it's been a great week of actual seeing some things in a different light. Because you always, when we get to these passages, it's normally Easter. So what we're talking about is just the cross. But sometimes when we read them in the off-season, because I don't know how else to describe that, not on the holidays that they're supposed to liturgically be on, then we get to see them in a different venue, in a different light, and we see different things that get highlighted. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that Matthew, if this were like a movie, focuses on the cross, bless you, And then he almost immediately backs away and lets the cross kind of fuzzy while he concentrates on everything else that's going around it. Kind of a thing. Maybe the kid just needs to be blessed, and we will just bless him, and that's cool. Because if Jesus can let the little children come into him, then by golly, I'm not going to argue with him because he's God, and I don't like being wrong. But in the process, this is that beautiful, because what goes on around the cross is just as strong of a proof that he is the Messiah and the Son of God as anything else that happens at the cross. And so with all of that build-up, the text, Matthew chapter 27, verse 33 through 37, or 32 through 37, sorry. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, or Golgotha, depending on which school of thought you're from, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head, they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Father God, we thank you that you are the King of the Jews. We thank you that you are our propitiation, that you died on the cross for our sins, paying the price that it cost to get us reconciled back to God the Father. We thank you so very much for that. And we would just ask that you would help us to love you more. Help us to see this in all of your greatness. Help us to realize that you are drawing all men unto yourselves, and that what we have to do is preach the cross, and often. Help us to give people the chance that they have to either accept you or reject you, but let it not be that we just didn't give it to them. God, give us wisdom, give us patience, and give us understanding. And in your name we pray. Amen. Yeah. Now, I find a lot of things in here fascinating. And what we're going to look at is not just the crucifixion, but all of these other little scenes that are on the peripheral. And some of these I find very fascinating, and some of them I hadn't really thought too strongly about before. Verse 32, which again we're using as our transition from last week into this week, ends with, they've mocked Jesus. The soldiers have punched him out, they've ripped out his beard, they've flogged him, they've done all of that, and now they're bringing him excuse me, from there to the place in which he's going to be crucified. And part of the humiliation of that is you have to carry your own cross from the starting point to the place where they're going to crucify you, which here is Golgotha. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But as they are going, because Jesus has just been beaten, because he's just been, he can't get there. He gets part of the way through, and likely, historically speaking, you would carry the horizontal, the horizontal beam, not the whole cross. It's not to say that he's not carrying the whole cross, but most of the time the vertical beam would already be in place. And then you would just be hoisted up and the two connected. But some of that gives and takes. Sometimes if it was a spot where they hadn't done crucifixion before, the vertical beam wouldn't be there. And so there's a lot of variables, and we can't say this is definitely how that worked. But as Jesus is walking, he collapses. And they realize, well, he's going to die before we get him to, we get to throw him up on the cross. This isn't good. So they indenture this guy named Simon, who is from Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya area. So let that sit in your mind for a second. But as the other gospel accounts tell us, Simon actually has his two small boys, one of which is named Rufus. I don't remember the other one's name. Rufus is not theological. But he does show up in one of Paul's letters, which is just interesting. Apparently this makes a really strong impression when Rufus watches his dad carry Jesus' cross. which is the picture, by the way, of when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. So Simeon has the unfortunate designation, not example, of being the first guy to actually take up the cross and follow Jesus. It happens to literally be a great picture of what discipleship looks like. That's what we mean. Not, oh, I'm giving up chocolate for the glory of God. Though sometimes giving up chocolate is for the glory of God. I had a friend who gave up Dr. Pepper for the glory of God because he had realized that the caffeine in it, and since he was drinking way too many Dr. Peppers, that there was starting to be, so there was a longer backstory. I'm not telling you Dr. Pepper is evil, because there's a real probability that whenever I go, wherever I'm going to go eat next, that it'll probably be Dr. Pepper that I drink. But, so it's, anyways, all of that to say squirrel back in his cage. But what we have here is actually a really interesting picture that I'm not sure I caught too much of before, and we don't want to turn this into too much of a theological point. But one of the things that was more in view to me today is, and the reason I pointed out where Simeon was from, he is from Libya, essentially. Now, I understand that it says Cyrene, but modern places contextualize. This makes him African. And I point this out for this reason. Jesus is Semitic. He comes from Shem. That's why we say anti-Semitism. It's built off Shem's name. So here we have two of Noah's sons, Shem and Ham. Ham goes south, traditional thought anyways, and so most of Africa finds its base actually back in Ham. And there's some really bad theology because of that. It just, you'll notice the bad theology if you hear it, just go, no, that's not how that works. But you also now have Ham and Shem. The other son is named Japheth, which is, Ham, Shem, and apparently he was waxing eloquent on the day of Japheth. But Japheth actually ends up being where most Europeans come from, aka the Romans. So what is interesting here, and I'm not sure I want to push this too far theologically, but it is interesting to me that this is now framed with the whole world being present and the whole world being drawn into this drama of the cross. There is a certain beauty here that whether clearly God is sovereign and clearly God has orchestrated it, that's the point of the sermon, by the way, is that we see God's sovereignty at play even in man's worstness, in his most vileness, in the most apparent, abhorrent thing possible. The biggest miscarriage of justice, we still see God as sovereign. That's what this is painting. And as a result, we see Jesus being justified. But in that, we see in this backdrop that the whole world, so to speak, is present. The whole world is participating in the cross and in the crucifixion. And the question is, which way do we want to participate in it? Do we want to participate as those who are going to stand and mock and be, very aggressively antagonistic? It's alliterated, I'm kind of proud of that one. Or are we going to come over here and we're going to be those who are sorrowful and realize that should be me? That should be me, but my God is so great and my God is so mighty that that's what He can do. He can take my sin and kill it. He can take my sin and actually atone for it in a permanent, eternal way that sacrificing the animals never could. That's how great our God is. And that's why we're using that as the title for the sermon, is we see the picture of Christ taking the whole world onto Himself and saying, yep, you're no good, dirty, rotten scoundrels. Yes, what you're doing is an abhorrent injustice, and it is as wrong can be. It is the most vile, evil thing that has ever and will ever be done. And yet, watch how I turn it into I'm still sovereign. Watch how I take it, and this has been the plan all along. And that's the rest of this backdrop. So verse 33, as they get there, they come to a place called Golgotha. Now or the place of the skull. Now there's some give and take. If you were to hop a plane and you go to the other side, and in Israel there are at least 2 places that claim this is the spot. I don't care. I mean, it's not like you get kudo points for touching the place. You don't get an extra 20 points on your salvation card. It just doesn't work that way. So, 1, I don't care. And 2, I wonder if, because part of why we argue about it is, well, this one looks like it's a skull. This one, well, if it did once upon a time, and if you squint, you can kind of see it, it's eroded. I'm not sure that it necessarily looked that way. Part of me wonders if it's not called the place of the skull because this is where we kill people. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm going to routinely kill people at a certain spot, and I am bothered by, and I know that just got weird, but if that's the place of execution, and that's the place of execution of riffraff, then you don't really take the time to give huge elaborate burials to riffraff. Just take them and toss them. I mean, that's how this works. So I imagine that if this is a normal spot of execution, which it likely is, that is why it is more so named the place of the skull than because, oh look, it artistically looks that way. I mean, I'm not saying it's not, and there's a lot of people who have strong opinions here. I'm just saying that this seems to be more, they take him to the place of death. This is where they're going. That everything just says, this is where it ends, this is where it's over. And we know that this is only where it begins. Like, we have the benefit of being able to turn to chapter 28 and going, ha-ha. And then we have the ability to turn to Revelation and say, ha-ha, we really win. But at this point in the story, if we were to limit ourselves, which would be hard, to just where we are and not have the foreknowledge of what's coming up, then we might go, yes, this is clearly the dark ending of the movie. And so it fits that they go to a place, the skull. And when they get there, verse 34, they gave him wine to drink, mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. Now, one of the other Gospels has, instead of gall, it has myrrh. Likely what you have is, it probably was myrrh, and gall is a description of taste. This is not a refreshing, soothing drink. I'm going to give you a little bit of its context, and then I'm actually going to take you back into the Old Testament. Surprise, surprise. What this is one of 2 probable things. Either 1, it's a painkiller. So with myrrh, what you have is, we're going to give you something so that you kind of go into la-la land, it'll ease your suffering, and you'll die a lot faster. Or it's just simply adding to the misery. I tend to think that it is much more the first. Because as he tastes it, he rejects it as a painkiller. Because what Jesus is doing on the cross is not just giving us a good example. Because if that's the good example, then we might have other questions that we'd have to ask. But instead, what Jesus is doing is he's saying, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to atone for the sins of the whole world. Well, if he is taking the narcotic pain med on the side, then he's not fully embracing the suffering. He's skirting around that, which is why he rejects it. So here what we see is an intentional conscience effort and intentionality of taking all of the suffering onto himself. That's what this is about. But what also makes it interesting is if we go to Psalm chapter 69, verse 21, and 69 as a whole is also worthwhile to read, but because I know that I don't have time to do all of the back that I want to. They also gave me gall for my food, and for my first they gave me vinegar to drink. May their table before them become a snare, and when they are in peace may it become a trap. And there are some longer things in here, and if you read them as a whole, Psalm 69, it's one of those that has some cross implications to it. But verse 21, they also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. What this is even in man's attempt to mock him most, they are just simply following the script of God. Do they make a real choice to mock him? Yeah, absolutely. Are they really going to be accountable for it? Yes, absolutely. Is God surprised by anything that happens? No. Is God in charge of what is happening? Yes. That's clear. That is made known very clear by Matthew in the circumstances that he is actually framing in on and keeping in focus. Is everything that happens around the cross and everything that happens around the crucifixion, he directly links back to the Old Testament. And not just as a way of saying, oh, we shouldn't be surprised, but as a way of saying, this is God sovereignly at work. And if God is sovereignly at work, maybe he is the Christ after all. Maybe we should hang in and see what happens in the justification of his resurrection here. That's what is in view here. It's also important when you remember that if Matthew is writing to early Christians and early Jewish converts especially in Jerusalem pretty early. I think Matthew is one of the earliest Gospels. I try not to get too technical in nerd discussions. But as such, and the reason why I mention that is because the early Christians, especially in Jerusalem, and especially Jewish converts to Christianity, are very persecuted by their society. They're not high-fived by their family. We just crucified your Savior. Why are you going over that way? Is the mentality that they get. Paul goes out looking for Christians to kill them. He's definitely not going out to buy them breakfast. Unless it's a last meal kind of a thing. He's just done with them. This is then refreshing to hear if you are, oh yeah, Christ suffered and that was part of God's sovereign will. Ergo, when I suffer, I bet that's also, I bet God's got that too. That's the draw here. Is that when they mock him, God already knew that was coming. God's orchestrated it. He has a plan for that. When they mock him by giving him poison to drink that may or may not be somewhat medicinal, God's already built that into the script. While they're making real choices, yes. While they're making real decisions, yes. At the same time, God's still sovereignly in control. Both of those things are happening. But not only that, and when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. Now, one of the other Gospels tells us that they do this because his garment is a nice garment. Apparently, he did wear, a good three-piece suit. It was one piece, but we also, that's a Sunday school joke, sorry. My teacher has given me some great things to think about this morning, and sometimes my squirreliness did too. But in the course of things, Jesus has a really nice outer garment, which is what they are now gambling for. And you can, with a simple Google search, pull up what would have been their pie will kind of casting. And I can't remember exactly how it works, but they would have put all of the things that they were gambling for. So his garment, his shoes, his, all of these other things that they're into kind of this circle, and they have this way of playing a dice game for it. that has real rules and is kind of structured. Because this is what they do. It's part of the kickback for being on crucifixion duty is you get part of the stuff. It's a normal practice. But at the same time, if you were to go to Psalm chapter 22, you would find that this is directly mentioned there in verse 18. It directly talks about they're going to cast lots for my garments, while I have my bones showing, which, not to be overly graphic, after the flogging he's just endured, his bones are showing. After being nailed to the cross, his bones are showing. So this is a direct one-for-one. So I would encourage you very strongly, if you do nothing else between now and next week, read Psalm 22. One day I'm just going to bite the bullet and we're just going to preach through it, but next week won't be that week. But there's a lot of, like, if you can read chapter 22 of the book of Psalms and not see the crucifixion in Christ, I don't know what to tell you. Because it's so blatant on this side of the cross to look back and go, Jesus, 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 Jesus. But the neat thing is not just to look and say, Jesus, 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 but at the end of it you see the why. And he will make mention of, to gather those to me. I will praise your name in the assembly. I will bring you glory. And there are these statements of the why, which is really why I like the song. But anyway, so this connects back there. So again, what you have is, in this picture, the way in which we've described it, is Matthew's focused on the cross, and then he backs off and he goes to the crowd in order to show God's sovereignty at work. So while the soldiers are thinking, yeah, this is just another great kickback, just another great perk for us, that we get the dead guy's clothes, because clothes are expensive in the ancient world. I think we've made mention of this before, where I have enough t-shirts where I could wear, a t-shirt every day for a year, not wear the same one twice, and probably go a couple of years, if we're going to be real honest. In the ancient world, you have one set of clothes. You don't have fancy and wear clothes, which is why you take off your outer garment when you go to do work. When you're going to get dirty, you take your outer garment off, because you only have one. And most of the time, if you have, you start growing and, it starts to, do like the capri pant thing. I'm not against capri pants. I just needed the illustration of something. Then what you would do is you would just find some rags over here, or you would find some material over here, and you'd add it to it. So that way, you'd lengthen it out a little bit. And there were actually stores that sold that kind of material. And that's why you don't put a new cloth on an old garment, because as it begins, it stretches different. And then you have, instead of one rip here, you've got 3 others here. Fabric's expensive. So they see he has a single piece of fabric garment, which is pretty rare in the ancient world. It's really rare, so you don't want to just rip it up into different parts and gamble that way. So they're gambling it all for this one, which is exactly what God said was going to happen. It may be part of what normally happens at crucifixion, but when we go back to when Psalm 22 is written, crucifixion wasn't a thing. So I don't care how common it is in Roman practice, it's not at all even thought of in Jewish thought in King David's day. But then we find that the Roman soldiers, after they've divvied up the goods, they sit down and they just begin to keep watch over him there, which has kind of this benignness to it of they're now just going to make sure he's okay. Not really. I mean, they're crucifying him. To keep watch in this case is not the same as to keep watch over the flock by night. This is, we're going to make sure nobody comes and tries to take him down by force, which does happen when people are crucified. Not as often as we would think, but oftentimes if you're a zealot, for instance, which Jesus is, by the way, hung between 2 thieves who are insurrectionists, not thieves in the classic steal your wallet, pickpocket kind of way. But these guys, in order, like their buddies are prone to try and come down and knock the crosses down or kill them so they're not suffering, or these sorts of things. They have zealots. They have guys that we would commonly refer to as terrorists for friends. So there's a reason the Roman soldiers are watching. It's part of the let's make sure that they get as much mockery as possible. But we also then have this in verse 37. And above his head, they put up the charge against him. Now this would have been on a wooden placket. The nerd word for it is titulus. And it essentially was just this is why he's here. And the reason the Romans do that is because they want to tell you, he's here because he did this. Therefore, you shouldn't do this. Because if you do this, this is where you will also be. So it's a way of just kind of strongly deterring other people from doing the same thing. Now, what is interesting is if you look at what originally the high priest charged Jesus with at the destruction of the temple, you'll notice that's not why he's here. You'll also notice that a lot of what they were trying to get Pilate and or Herod, if you read the other Gospels, to buy into is not this. But yet Pilate puts on the titulus as the inscription, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now he is doing that on purpose just to hack him off. Because again, he hates the Jews. He hates them as much as they hate him. So by saying to them, okay, I found no fault in him, I think the guy's innocent, and I've actually found him more fascinating than all the rest of you talking heads, this is what I think of you. Here is your king. By putting on him Jesus, King of the Jews, it's a way also for him to say, this is what I think should happen to the rest of you. This is what should be y'all's fate too. And given half a chance, this is what I'm going to do to you all. Which is interesting, because what do we know about the cross? What is it that we always say? He's our propitiation. That should have been us. Pilate got it in a weird way. Pilate got, that should be y'all. Now, the problem with Pilate's declaration is that Pilate says y'all. Right? I mean, I can't say that should have been y'all without being really dumb. Because that should be us. There has to be the first person pronoun in there, whether it's first person singular or first person plural. It has to be, there goes I. Every crack of that whip should have been mine to bear. But love is on his hands, and love is on his mind. This is one of those really odd moments in which somebody says something very profound without knowing it. In the book of John, for instance, you actually have a couple of times in the premeditation, you get a lot more of that. The high priest actually says something like, don't you understand that it's better for one person to die and bear the punishment than all of us? That's very prophetic. For a guy that you don't believe is the Messiah, that's very prophetic to say, sir. But also there's well, if he is the Messiah, we should leave him be because nothing we can do can stop him. And if he's not, then he's going to self-destruct anyways. Oh, look, you tried to crucify him and you lost. I'm pretty sure. So again, you have these moments in which people say very profound things without intending them to be profound. I think this is one of those. Pilate is saying, there's the King of the Jews. It's also legitimately why he is on the cross. And a non-trumped up charge, that's legitimately why he's there. He is on the cross because he is the King of the Jews. And not just the Jews, but he's on the cross because he's the King of the world. And because he's the King of the world, because he is God, he can go to the cross and resurrect. Because he is the king, he is the unblemished lamb before the foundations of the world. He is able to take the sin of the world onto himself. He is able to become our punishment for sin. We are able, because he's the king of the world, to become his righteousness. Because this is true, we can be rectified back to God. So there is this sense in which what Matthew is doing is he's pointing and saying, look at how Pilate is meaning this in the most vile possible way that he can. And yet, God's sovereignty is true. And yet, we clearly see the outworking of God's plan in this. We clearly see God going, yeah, Jesus, Yahweh saves. That's exactly what's happening here because he's the king of the world. It's this beautiful picture of, and a reminder for us, that in those moments in which we go, all hope is lost. We're done. The boat is sunk. We're just done. To go, I bet the crucifixion, I bet Golgotha looks like Jesus is done. I bet it looks like God doesn't know what God is doing. I know it looks like God just lost. But it is the most phenomenal win ever. Yeah. It's kind of like, and I just totally forgot his name, and I wish that I hadn't. But in the American Revolution, John Paul Jones? No. I'll remember it part of the way through. But his ship is sinking, and the British are like, dude, you should give up. Just surrender so that we'll take you as prisoner, but you won't drown. And he pulls out his sword and says that iconic line of, I have not yet begun to fight. And then he ends up taking their ship and is like, thanks for your ship. You're now my prisoners. I made up the last line. I totally went blank on his name. He's a very famous guy, and it's going to bug me. I'll get to it later. But this is that I've not yet actually begun to fight moment. We think all hope is lost. It looks like the ship is sinking. But instead, this is the high point. This is that beautiful look of, they think they're winning. Our world thinks they're winning. Our world thinks that they have finally gotten enough people to push Christianity into this little box and send people back to their little hovels and just be done with this whole mythological thing. And that we can just get on with science, and we can just get on with life, and we can just get on with being horrible, vile people. Though they have a different adjective for horrible and vile. But whatever. They think that they've finally gotten Jesus out of the way, and that they can move on with their life. However, he doesn't stay there. Jesus doesn't stay in a box very well. He's not really let me put you in this nice little package, and okay, you can do that over there. He tends, because he is the king of the world, to bust out of those little packages. Because God is sovereign. And one of the things that we need to remember is that our hope is not who sits in the White House. It is not who sits on the Supreme Court. It is not who we elect to Congress in either of the houses. It's not how well can we prep our doomsday bunkers. It's not how well can we do any of these other things. Our hope is in the one who is actually sovereign. Yeah. I'm not telling you not to plan. I'm not telling you not to vote. I'm just saying, if your hope is based upon who your political, civil leaders are, I'm sorry. That's a problem. Yeah. Because have you looked at them lately? I mean, politics. Poly meaning many, ticks, blood-sucking animals. Just to let you know what I think. That's the Latin origins, I think. I think that's the etymology. I should be careful with that. But in the course of things, but since I'm calling them all that instead of just one or two, then, we're not in any trouble legally. You're just all horrible. But in the course of things, and not all of them are, I get it. But in the course of things, this is what we have to realize. God is sovereign. No matter what looks like it's going on, God is working out a plan. And God is working out and directly orchestrating the same plan that he has always been orchestrating and working. Nothing is catching him off guard. Nothing is catching him outside of those perimeters, even when the world does its worst. That is when we should stand up and say the loudest, God will do his best. Because we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. And that is an important caveat to that statement. It doesn't mean that all things are good or that all things work out for all people. It works out for the good of those who love him. And we're definitely not going to say that crucifixion is good. But its end result is a good thing. Yeah. Us being reconciled to God is a good thing. This is also what we need to take to people who aren't sitting next to us this morning. And say, hey, God's sovereign, even when it doesn't look that way. And as a result, here's what he did for you. We need to give them the truth that God is in control and God has made a way for them to come back to it. That's also, here in a minute, we're going to transition over to a commission. That's what we send people to Nicaragua for. This is why we send people to Haiti for. This is why we send people to countries that we don't mention publicly. There's a reason why people have weird names for their Facebook names now. There's a reason why people go to places that don't want them there doing what they're doing. But at the same time, all that's well and good, but your neighbor also needs to hear it. The lady at the checkout line, she also needs to hear it. The guy who runs the service station and fixes your car, he needs to hear it. These are the things that we're called to remember and called to tell what we know of. If you would, pray with me. Father God,